I would like to ask, based on what we played, we got an idea that you don't want to do any revolution in gameplay. You want to improve all the mechanics. Is it right?
I'd say that's true, except I guess I'm not sure that's true, because I feel like a lot of the new improvements that we're introducing are revolutionary enough to be considered like quantum leaps above, where The Last of Us 1 was. So, for example, like introducing a dodge into melee combat, like I don't think that's a subtle improvement or a little tweak. That like fundamentally changes the gameplay. Like it really introduces a new dimension into the melee combat. Another thing I would say is going prone. Like that's not something where it's like, oh, we improved the stealth slightly. That's an entirely new player state that you can go into yourself, and also that enemies can knock you into. Like when a dog like tackles you to the ground, now you're left on the ground and you can aim from the ground. You can even dodge out of the way from the ground. So, I mean, while it's true that it's still a stealth action game, it's still a third-person game, I'd say that actually like there are a vast number of new mechanics that totally change how the game is played. So I'd argue that it is actually a pretty remarkable improvement over the first game.
And what do you think is the biggest difference, biggest new feature in Last of Us Part 2?
So probably the biggest one is the dodge, like I mentioned before. I mean, that's really like a fundamental shift in how you deal with melee enemies. I think one thing that's really cool about our game is that instead of just being a can dodge animation that you play in any direction, it's sensitive to the nature of the enemy attack that's coming at you and the direction that you're going. So if someone is swinging their weapon like this and you're trying to move in that direction, Ellie will duck under it and go in that direction. So it really is this very fluid and kind of uniquely Naughty Dog animation system in terms of dodge. I think what's really cool is that there are also a broad range of new enemy types that you come up against that are totally new challenges. So the attack dogs that you fought in the second part of the demo, not only do they create new aiming challenges because they're so fast and low to the ground they can be tough to aim at, they create this like kind of very frightening melee enemy because they could tackle you to the ground and deal a lot of damage that way. But they also completely change stealth gameplay. Like, whereas before it was able to just hang back and players could just avoid enemies and just say like, okay, I'm just going to play very defensively and hopefully no one sees me. In The Last of Us Part 2, the dogs can sniff you out. So if they cross your trail, they'll hunt you down and you can't just like stay in one place. You'll have to use a tool or deal with them or get even further away because they'll eventually find you. So I feel like that they've created like a bunch of new different ways that the gameplay is very, very different. Also the new infected classes I think are really fascinating, where we have the Shambler that can explode with these corrosive acid clouds. So as you're fighting them, not only do you have to avoid them, but when you're running away from them you have to look around and make sure that you're not running into one of those clouds and taking even more damage. Another thing I'm really excited about is the breadth of our environments and our level design. So one thing that we're really emphasizing is, I don't know if you encountered the two Shamblers that were in the basement of the liquor store, but that's a completely optional encounter. It's totally optional to the story. It's just something for the player to discover in a very broad space that you can explore. So we feel like certain moments are way more intriguing to the player if they feel like they discovered them themselves and that they could have missed them. It makes it feel like it's much more special, and that's something that we're really pushing in this game, is having a lot more of those. And additionally in combat, like in the area with a lot of houses, you can go in the houses, you can go in the backyards, you can go upstairs, you can go out onto the balconies. It's such a complicated space to be like losing and dealing with enemies. I think that the level design is something that we're really kind of pushing to the next level.
Both demos were quite different in pace, in amount of enemies and stuff. Did we see and played like a representative part of the game, or there will be more changes even after the second demo, which was in some later part of the game?
So I think it's important to realize that even though we showed like quite a bit of gameplay and in like two very different locations, this is really only a slice of what's in the game. There's so much more as you saw in the trailer, there are all kinds of different locations that Ellie visits. So there's the flooded city that she's boating through. You know, there's the more forested area. There's the area that we showed at E3. The enemies that she fought in E3. So like what you played today was really just a very, very small part of a much bigger game.
And when we speak about both demos, where exactly, if it's possible to say, where the second demo, like in a term or scale, the whole game? It's like half.
Yeah.
Or?
So I can't pin down exactly when that is, but it's far enough along that you have learned all of these new mechanics. So you can kind of tell because there's so many more mechanics present in the second demo. Like you had the new crafting items like the trap mine and the craftable silencer, you got the bow weapon, you had a way bigger arsenal of weapons. So you can kind of get some sense that that would have been like a little while after the first one.
Is it true that The Last of Us Part 2 is the longest game made by Naughty Dog? Could you tell us more about the length, about the hours we will spend in the game?
So at some point I would be really excited to talk about the exact number of hours, but because we're not at the end of development yet, we actually don't really know the exact length of the game. But what I can say is it's not just the longest game that Naughty Dog has ever made, it's by far the longest game that Naughty Dog has ever made, by a significant amount.
And is it linear game and linear story, or are there any story choices?
No, it's a completely linear story, just like our other games. And I think what's important to realize when I'm talking about how long the game is, that's a length that there's no grinding, there's no like kind of fetch quests or something that pads the game length out. That is like, this is the longest game that Naughty Dog has ever made, and the content is as detailed and as crafted as all of our games are.
Neil Druckmann says lots of things about motivation in the part 2. It's not only like laugh and care about our friends and our family. It's hate or anger or something which drives Ellie towards the end of the game. Could you like tell more what exactly maybe happened, or what exactly motivates Ellie to go further, like where the anger is starting?
So we're so careful to show just a certain amount of the game because as creators and as fans ourselves, we know how damaging to the experience a spoiler can be. So every bit of information that we've given is very specific and crafted, and to give you just enough of an idea of what's happening without getting too much into specifics. But what I can say is that we're delving into some pretty difficult themes and looking at kind of like a darker side of the human experience in this game. And I think one way that we're doing that is by kind of putting the player in situations where they realize that violence is actually kind of unpleasant and regrettable. Like I think a big part of The Last of Us is that when you're fighting against enemies, they're not just faceless video game goons that it's like, you know, whatever to kill. That's why we added names to all of our NPCs. So all of the human NPCs in the game have names, and they'll call out their names when they coordinate with each other to attack you. They'll express anguish when one of their friends dies and call out their name when they see their friend die. And that's, I think, a way where we take the humanity of our enemies to the next level. And I think it really speaks to the themes of the game that the cycle of violence is something that has a cost to one's own humanity.
Was it difficult to set the limit for this behavior of AI? Like when, for example, I killed a dog very brutally. Some people just scream the name of the dog or starting to cry. I felt really moved, you know, like because I felt for the dog, even it was enemy. So was it difficult to set the proper level of brutality and this kind of feelings?
So we did have some challenges there, but I think in the end, what guided us is just trying to be honest, like be as honest as possible about what this type of situation would feel like, and go from there. And we really wanted to do something that felt true to a world where the stakes are very high and where violence has real consequences.
I would like to ask about the romantic relationship between Ellie and Dina. Was it challenging to include love into this world?
I mean, it's definitely challenging to portray anything with the level of care and nuance that I think we try to portray everything in. So it absolutely was challenging, but it's as challenging as any of the storytelling that we do. But I think a key part of what makes The Last of Us special is you have these action sequences or these combat sequences that are intense and strategic and really employ like kind of your tactical mind and express the brutality of the world. But on the flip side, you have these moments of tenderness, of humanity, of love between people, and I think that's a core part of the cocktail of The Last of Us. And I think that the sequence between Ellie and Dina is so incredible because the way they talk to each other about their ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend, and the way they are kind of tentatively starting to fall in love with each other and express that they really are attracted to each other. It took me back to like high school, of like those times when I could feel my cheeks going red because I'm blushing, like trying to tell someone that I cared about them. And I really love that this game is able to do all of these things, like this intense spectrum from one side to the other of like these very difficult dark moments and these very sweet and human and true to life moments that I think remind us all of ourselves.
I would like to ask as well one more difficult part about how it is for you to release the game at the end of this console generation. If it's really difficult to amaze people, your fans, with the graphics, with the technology, because you know the PlayStation 5 maybe will release next year or in
near future.
I guess I'm not too worried about amazing our fans with what's present in the game, because what I've come to realize over the course of making this game, I mean, you play the demo. I myself am just continually amazed by what's in the demo. Both, I think it's easy to talk about the graphics of the environments, but the animations I think are absolutely incredible, and the sound design is also like we've taken immense steps forwards in the sound design. And across all of those, the thing that really jumps out to me is that it's true that the power of the hardware is incredibly important, but you can see that there's a big jump between Uncharted 4 and The Last of Us Part 2, even on the same hardware. And what I've come to understand is that as important as the hardware is, the techniques are actually even more important. So the cleverness of the algorithms, how you're putting your assets together, that can have just such a huge effect. So one thing that I think is really exciting about this game is we're using this new animation technique called motion matching, where in most games, or in our prior games, when you would tell a character to run forward and then run to the left, there would just be some code that said, if you're pressing forward, go forward, and if you're pressing to the left, run to the left. Now, what we do is we take a motion capture actor and we put them on the stage and we tell them to run in this crazy way and then turn around and then turn like this, and it's called a dance card. And we take that huge amount of animation data and chop it up into tiny little pieces. And then when the player wants to run forward and to the left, an algorithm says like, oh, your velocity was this and your stick direction was this. So take 3 of these animations, blend them together so each individual frame is programmatically as smooth as possible so that the motion matches. That's why it's called motion matching. And I think as you control Ellie or see the enemies move around in the game, when you see the dogs and the horses move around in the game, you'll see like all the animation is incredibly fluid with very little sliding, and it's because of this incredible system. And it's true that it's a little bit more computationally intensive and it does take up some more memory, but really it's the algorithm that is the most complicated part. So I think that's why even towards the end of this console generation, I think we're still going to be able to absolutely amaze people because it's the techniques more than anything.
Is it possible to say how long did it take to finish or prepare this algorithm, as you said, for your animators and programmers?
I do not have the technical expertise to know that, but I do know it was a humongous effort because it's completely different from how we've made games in the past. So one thing that's very challenging about it is, rather than, if you see something wrong, you can't just say like, oh, fix this one line of code. Instead, it's like, something's wrong with this whole thing. I just kind of have to steer it in the right direction because it's such a complicated, the algorithm is making the decisions rather than the programmer. So in a way, it's not exactly, but it's a way it's like its own kind of AI agent that's choosing your animations for you. I do know that they had to do these dance cards, these like crazy long loopy animations. They did that with a dog in a mocap suit. And they did it with a horse in a mocap suit, if you can believe it, in like a huge stadium like as big as this. They like mocap this horse running around, and that's why it looks as incredible as it does.
And from your point of view, what was the main obstacle, main hurdle? If you remember one concrete particular thing, if there's any.
In making this demo or the game as a whole?
Game as well.
Well, I'll just talk about the demo in particular, and I will say it was, without a doubt, the dogs were very, very challenging. So because the dogs were a completely new kind of game mechanic, and we had no model for how to make it work, because it wasn't like something in the first game or something we had even seen done in other games. We just had no model to work from. Although it looks very smooth right now, there are actually huge challenges in making the camera work when you're in melee. So because, normally when you're fighting, we have all these assumptions in our game design that the camera is going to be looking and that your enemies are going to be about as tall as you. So when you're meleeing someone, the camera can be right here. But when you're meleeing a dog, the camera would have to pitch down like this, and then if you ever needed to aim again, so the camera would do all this crazy stuff, or people would, they couldn't figure out how to escape them. The dogs would rush them and they didn't feel like they had a chance to aim. So there are all these like techniques we had to use, like when they rush you, frequently they'll run at you and then they'll like pause for just a second before they pounce at you. And just that little bit of time is enough to get people to like aim down at them or dodge out of the way. And then like we also, kind of made, when you attack them in melee, we made those moves very drawn out, so it gives us time to bring the camera down with them, and then time to give it back and bring it back up. So those are some of the design challenges that we ran into. Yeah. People really hated them for a long time, but we have some really excellent systems designers, and so I'm excited that they were able to overcome those challenges.
Maybe the last question, or one of the last questions, what's your personal favorite part of the game?
My personal favorite part of the game is the way that we've really pursued a lot of broad systems in the game. So like what's really exciting to me is when systems can stack on top of each other to create these unexpected emergent situations. So I'll give you an example. We have windows that can break in combat. So something that can happen is the shambler can come out of the bar, and when it's trying to attack you, it explodes, and it explodes and shatters all the windows. So you have this like intersection, and then you can then use the fact that they're now blown up to like run back inside and like try to get around it because it's created this new path for you. One thing that happened to me was I was trying to, Ellie's rifle is powerful enough to shoot through 2 enemies at once. So I was being chased by infected, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be clever and hit 2 enemies at once. And I shot through one and killed it, and then the second bullet, or the bullet went through the second enemy and hit them in the leg and cut it off. And then that enemy fell to the ground and started crawling towards me. So like we have this new thing where like infected can have their legs blown off but stay alive and still crawl at you and try to grab you. And then I ran and like stomped it out. So it's these cool kind of like layers of different systems that can combine together to create these unexpected results. And that's the thing I'm most excited about in the game.
And last question from me. I can imagine that you've seen whole game, particularly like whole piece. Did you cry?
I did not cry. There is one part of the game where I did cry, even as like it was so rough. The graphics aren't there yet, the art isn't there yet, but it reminded me of something in my own life that was important to me, and I did cry. And so I think like when it's all done and there's the music and the sound and the graphics and the facial animation and stuff, yeah, I think people will for sure cry. There's no doubt in my mind.